Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is ACT, Bringing Resources to Bear During a Disaster. My name is Sal Gilberto. I'm a marketing director here at Everbridge. You'll be hearing from Brian Koon, who's the Vice President of IEM. So let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Again, thank you for logging in. So just a couple of agenda items. So I'm going to go over some housekeeping items that pertain to today's webinar. I'm going to introduce our speaker, then we're going to get right into it. We're going to get into the heart of the webinar, which is ACT, Bringing Resources to Bear During a Disaster. Then we will leave time for an interactive Q&A at the end. So with those housekeeping items, we often get asked, are we recording today's webinar? Will I get a copy of it? So the answer to those are yes. So we are going to record today's webinar. We will be emailing out that recording either tomorrow or Friday. Just give us a day or two to process that recording and get that out. So just take a look at your inboxes over the next couple of days. You should be getting a recording for you to re-review with the webinar or to share with colleagues. I also mentioned that today's session will have an interactive Q&A at the end. I do encourage questions throughout, so please do ask your questions at any point during the webinar. We will gather all of the questions and we will pose them to our speaker at the end. So if anything does kind of catch your eye and you want to know more information, don't hesitate. So you send it in during the webinar. The way to do that is to submit your questions via the GoToWebinar control panel. So there is there's a questions area. So just enter those questions and we will aggregate them all at the end of the webinar. So I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Brian Koon. He's the Vice President of IEM. He's the former Director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm terrific, Sal. Thanks.
Awesome. So I'm going to make you the presenter. And if you want to share your screen, I'll let you know when the audience can see it.
Okay,
perfect.
Got it.
Yep, you're good.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Good to be with you all again. I envision that I don't have a tremendous amount of folks from the Southeast today, as they are either dealing with or preparing for Hurricane Dorian. And so hopefully some of those folks will be able to watch this later on in the recorded version. I told Sal in the lead up to this, I've spent a good chunk of probably the last 4 or 5 days going on TV talking about the storm as a former director of state of Florida, kind of highlighting what I envisioned was potential for impacts to the state of Florida, what they were doing to prepare for it, and now it's moving up the coast. What some of the impacts might be up there as well. So if any of you all want to talk or ask questions about Dorian afterwards, I'd be happy to chat about that one as well. It is a heck of a hurricane, and Bahamas obviously devastated, and it's going to be many years recovery down there. Florida, I don't think probably even knows yet how close they came to avoiding a catastrophe on this one. So I mean, if it's 50 miles or so would have been the difference between getting by with hardly a scratch to just completely annihilating some of those coastal towns on eastern Florida. So happy to chat more about both in the context of this webinar and elsewhere, what are some of the potential impacts, or it could have been some of the potential impacts from Dorian. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. This is the third in a series of 4 different webinars. If some of you probably have been along for the whole ride, but if you weren't, we spent some time talking about how to build a common operating picture and how to build situational awareness and some of the tools and practices around making sure that you have as much information as possible and the right information to take the actions and make the decisions that you need to do in your job. The second one, we spent a lot of time talking about how to take that data and contextualize it and put it into a map or some kind of graphical format so that you could relate it to all of the other data that surrounded it and truly understand what it meant. And we discussed, again, some of the best practices associated with that, as well as highlighting the fact that a lot of these things you can't really get the complete picture until you see them visually connected with each other and the impacts that has. Today, of course, we're talking about how to bring a lot of these resources that we have to bear during a disaster. And then finally, we're going to wrap this series up sometime in November, likely, where we talk about how you capture data and begin the after action process, and some of the ways that you can do that. That, of course, is often the most important part of what we do here. Obviously, every disaster brings new challenges and new information, new methodologies. Some things work really well, some things do not. And so the only way for us to continue to improve is to sit down afterwards and say, hey, what went well, what went wrong, what can we do the next time this or a similar situation occurs, so that we can continue to evolve and do our jobs better and better every time. And frankly, that's one of the most exciting parts of what we do, is the ability to improve and move the ball forward. So that'll be in November. We'll have that conversation. Today, we're going to talk about two primary parts. One is, what is the plan, and how do we use it? I mean, that seems like a fairly intuitive, simple question, but we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And then, what do we say? How are we communicating, and to whom? In what way are we saying it, to make sure that they're hearing the same things that we're trying to say, and we're conveying to them what it is we need them to know, what it is that we want them to do. And so we'll get into that a little bit there at the end. All right, so let's dive right into it. So I think this one will probably resonate with most of you. I know it certainly did with me as I created it. And many of you, again, have probably been on both sides of this equation. And sometimes you're on both ends of the equation at the same time. But if you're like me, and almost any organization in which you have worked in the emergency management, homeland security field, you probably have a fair number of plans, and some of them are quite detailed and robust and thorough, and some of them may not be as much. Some of them are shiny and new. Some of them are probably a little bit dusty. And everything in between, all of those. And so the question becomes, how do we make sure that our plans are appropriate to the current environment, to the threats that we're going to face today and tomorrow and next month and next year? And there's a challenge there. And the challenges there's a fair number of challenges. One is just the identity of the individuals involved in the planning effort, and the identity of the people involved in the operational aspect of whatever issue it is we're facing. Sometimes there's an overlap there, particularly in smaller organizations, but as you get into larger and larger organizations, those could be completely independent entities. And so the planning people will never execute, and the execution people, the operators, may never be involved with the planning aspect of it. And so that's a gulf right there. Is the challenge is overcoming, how do you take these two distinct and separate entities and ensure that they are designing products that meet both of their needs and that actually are utilized during the situation, that whatever it is that you're facing. The next one is time. As I said earlier, some of those plans that you may have out there could be a bit dusty. And unless you are diligent about pulling those plans out and reviewing them on a frequent basis, and that frequency depends a whole lot on what the plan is for and the types of entities involved. But there's nothing worse than pulling out a plan for a situation only to realize that every person listed in it, every organization listed in it, every phone number, point of contact has changed, that the concept of operations has changed, that the facilities have changed. And so frankly, the older the plan, the harder it is for it to remain current and relevant when you need it. And so there's a lot of discipline that goes into maintaining those older plans and making sure they're still going to meet the need. Physical location, again, sometimes the physical location of the two entities are in different offices, in different buildings, different organizations. And so that creates a gulf between the planners and the operators. And it could be as simple as a down the hall. It could be one building next to each other. It could be across town. It could be across multiple counties, cities, states. That physical location, the farther again you are from each other, the harder it is to achieve the synchronicity that you're looking for in this kind of situation. Positions in the organization can make a difference. A lot of times the planning group is more junior than the people who are doing the operations. And so there may be some disconnect between what the planners think those operators are going to be thinking about and doing in that situation. And there may be some disconnect between what the operators and the senior folks are understanding what the planners did. You may also have the inverse, which is that the folks who do the planning may actually be more technically expert than the operators, particularly in emergency management when you have a higher rate of turnover at the senior level and the politically appointed level of the organization. You could have people who have 5, 10, 20 years of experience writing the plans only to be executed by somebody with 3 months to 6 months of experience in the job, and then frankly not understanding necessarily the nuances of what the planners were considering there, and therefore not understanding the justification, the reason behind what that plan has in it. And then finally, there is a potential of the lack of awareness of the capabilities, either overestimating or underestimating the capabilities of the operators in carrying out these plans. And frankly, a lot of these things change over time. Capabilities come and go, and what the planner was aware of or thinking of when they wrote the plan may no longer be the skill set that that organization has when it comes time to execute. It may be better, it might be worse. And so the way that the tasks are identified and assigned may not be appropriate for the mission when it comes time to actually execute it. So those again are a lot of the disconnects potentially between planners and the folks executing it. All of those again are overcomable. It requires diligence and awareness and focus on doing so. I put a quote there at the bottom. I think many of you are familiar with this quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And that is absolutely true. I will caveat it, however, that means that the Dwight D. Eisenhower and the people who were involved in the planning effort were the ones who executed it. If they are separate, then there is less value to be had. It doesn't really, I mean, the planners will go through all kinds of thought processes as they go through that planning, but unless some of that is baked into the folks who are doing the operations, not as successful. All right, so now we've talked a little bit about the challenges there. Let's talk about the execution of this plan. And this is just a stock photo on the right-hand side, but I think it probably looks similar to stuff that you guys may have in your office there. Racks and racks of plans there. And so the challenge becomes, and this is, we are moving past this. However, I bet you it still exists in many of the jurisdictions represented by those of you on the webinar with us today, which again are these are either paper bound or in a Word document, which is in effect, I mean, it's a digital version of paper bound. And so the first part of this thing is, event A occurs, getting those folks who are executing this and responsible for doing this plan to realize that you even in fact have a plan for this. And organizations that have as many plans as you see in this photo here, just the fact that somebody knows that you have a plan for this requires them to have some knowledge, and hopefully will have read the plan, trained the plan, exercised the plan. But awareness of a plan can be problematic. Locating the plan, and again, in larger organizations, knowing where it is and who can put their hands on it in a timely manner can be problematic. Oftentimes, in these kind of situations, especially in fast moving and quickly evolving situations, there's just not enough time, or the perception of not enough time to get that plan and to pull it out and start using it. And they're going either on their memory of that plan or what they perceive to be the best course of action based on their knowledge and awareness, independent of what the plan may have said or identified as the priorities and necessities at that point on it. And then again, they're in the midst of the decision makers, the folks who are executing this are being pulled in multiple different directions, all very quickly. Their phones ringing, their emails binging, the text messages are coming in, their bosses demanding information, the press is demanding information, citizens need to know what's going on, the law enforcement, the fire department, first responders, everybody is pulling on this individual or this organization. And so you lose the luxury then of re-familiarizing yourself with that written plan and understanding again some of the nuances and the specifics that are built into it. And so you've lost that ability at that point to really fully digest everything that the planners and subject matter experts had considered that should be thought about in the execution of that plan. So now that we've figured out that there is a plan of some sort, now it means what do you do with it? You got a plan here in whatever format. You got a binder, you got a document, you've got some version of a plan in front of you. How then do you take that and turn it into action items? You've got to be able to take, again, a lot of these plans, highly detailed, well thought out, have lots of assumptions, have lots of, if then, therefore kind of type things. But when it really comes down to it, now you need to be able to take that and say, you, person A, go do this. Person B, go do this. Person C, you go do this. And then come back and tell me how it's going. And we're going to be working on persons D through triple Z throughout this process. And that's multiplied by the size of the incident and the number of agencies involved. I drove by, I live in Tallahassee, Florida. That's where I am right now. I live about a mile from the State Emergency Operations Center. I drove by it this morning. There were probably 500 cars or so in the parking lot and the streets outside of it. There were at least 3 command vehicles that I could see out on the street, and probably a half a dozen more in the parking lot behind it. And that one emergency operations center with all of those people in it were linked electronically to the 67 counties of Florida, the federal government, probably 12 state agencies, water management districts, countless cities, etc. So all of those stakeholders are in there. How then do you take what's in that hurricane plan that the state of Florida definitely has? How do you take that and make sure that all of those organizations are aware of what's in there and what needs to get executed? So how do you take all of that, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't bog you down? You obviously have to disseminate this. You have to have a division of labor. You have to have a way for this to be broken out into components so that everyone can own a piece of it, but still be able to coordinate it all, and for the information to flow up and down, and awareness flow up and down, so that you all continue to move in the right direction. So we're going to work through a couple different, 3 different ways that can happen. Hit some of the pros and cons of each of those, and and start thinking about how we can continue to improve in this. I covered a little bit of this already. So a lot of this, for example, are you have to do things in a sequence there. You can't do task 3 until you completed task 2 and task 1. And so there's a requirement, therefore, for you to track all of this, to be able to sequence it so that you're not sending somebody out to do a job before they are able to do it, but that there's not long delays in between. Otherwise, you're wasting the valuable resources in terms of time, money, human capital that you have at hand there. So you have to be able to sequence these appropriate to the situation, and the situation is often dynamic. You've got to ensure that the single points of failure, the linchpins, the critical items are completed, because if those aren't, then the entire process, the entire system could fail. And so it's vital that you get feedback and on the completion of those items before you move on, and you're able to rework or reassess as necessary. And you got to keep everybody in the loop on this. Otherwise, you will spend all of your time answering questions. I think probably you, like me, have found that if you don't have good communications on the completions of these tasks and who's doing what, you will spend most of your time working on that, answering questions or answering emails or trying to explain who is doing what, where they're doing it, with what resources are they, where are they in the process. And so the smoother the ability to go up and down the chain of command, the better off you're going to be. The smoother you are at explaining that to your external stakeholders, at cities, the counties, the media, citizenry, the better off you're going to be. And that's vital. We've talked about that before. Information sharing really is one of the most important pieces of all of this. One of the things that we did when I was at the state of Florida was to hold, we'd always had twice daily conference calls with all of our county emergency managers and the National Hurricane Center and all of our state agency stakeholders in FEMA to discuss the latest forecast, who was doing what, etc. What we discovered over time was that ironically, by adding more conference calls, we could reduce our overall time communicating individually to other entities. And so we added a phone call with county elected officials. We added a phone call with city elected officials. We added a phone call and a conference with the utilities. We added one with the hospitals and other medical entities. And in so doing, we could in one fell swoop get them all of the information they were looking for, and frankly knock out 95% of the questions and issues they had in one call, as opposed to having dozens or scores of them. And so again, as you're executing these plans, the ability to get that information to and from everybody quickly makes a huge difference. I think you've also see it every time you have a press conference with a governor in advance of a storm, and you've all seen lots of those this past week. Oftentimes, the situation report will go out to those reporters right beforehand, or the governor will spend a little time at the top of the press conference highlighting those items. Makes a world of difference on the backside when it comes to questions. So people just want to understand that they're getting the most accurate, timely information. And so again, as you're pushing out this, here's the things that need to get done, your ability to get that fed back to you makes a huge difference. So let's go through some of the methods as to how this can happen. And they're kind of going from simplistic and oldest to some of the more modern ways of handling this. This, of course, is the easiest method here, and the most straightforward is to just have one person in charge, the single person in charge or the single entity in charge issuing tasks. And that works for small incidents, hyper local incidents. It does ensure control. It makes sure that nothing is missed because there's one person or one entity controlling everything. And this pro is a tongue-in-cheek pro, as you will note. This is a great methodology if this is a very slow moving system that you are dealing with. So if you're worried about a glacier overtaking your community, or you're working on some other system that's going to take a super long period of time and you lack any kind of time constraint, by all means use this one. It will work fine. However, if that's not what you're dealing with, and you're dealing with almost anything else, you're going to have some problems. You're going to have, if you do this, you're going to have a single point of failure, because eventually the person or the entity will not have the bandwidth necessary to process all of the information and data in a timely manner and issue all of the orders and to-dos from that plan. Yet they simply will not have that capacity. And that's going to happen fairly early in the incident, likely. This system is not going to work for speed, because again, they're going to get bogged down. The individual or the entity is going to get bogged down, and speed will slow. It won't work for multiple stakeholders, because frankly, the more groups you add, again, bogs it down even further. Variable conditions, things change during incidents. And so now you're adding in what we were working before has now taken a left turn. Sometimes it's a literal left turn in terms of hurricanes. And so now you need a different plan, a new idea. and you may have to scrap and rework some of what you've already done. Very difficult to do if you only have one entity in charge of everything. The feedback mechanism there is great for the one entity in control. They know everything. Everybody else knows very little because the information they have goes up to them, and it may or may not be disseminated amongst everyone else. And then, of course, it does not facilitate at all any kind of on-scene decision making by those folks who are right there, who see what's going on. They're not empowered. They don't feel that they have the ability to do the things they need to do, and as a result, things that could be delegated and could get done immediately get slowed down and not taken care of. The next, the next evolution of all of this is to take that plan that you've got and break it down into more actionable items. And you see this in job aids a lot. You know, one of my previous jobs, I was the director of emergency management for Walmart, and every couple of years, you all have seen these in the stores. Any store you go to, Walmart or any other retail store for that matter, somewhere in some corner of the store, you're going to have some kind of checklist that gives the employees of that store, here's the to-dos for this situation. Here's what you do if you have a chemical spill. Here's what you do for a fire. Here's what you do for a thunderstorm. And it's really a designed checklist for those folks who have had little to no training on that kind of incident to quickly understand what they should be doing. And it's just, you know, a series of bullet points there, probably, you know, put up a rope around the spill area, call the fire department, you know, lock the doors, what have you. That's the job aid. It's the idea that you're really putting something in people's hands who don't understand the full scope of what's going on, nor do they need to. They need to know what they need to do to get the job done quickly. It does give you some opportunity for some just-in-time training and background material. You could put a little bit in there, you know, that says, you know, chemical spills, and a list perhaps some of the potential chemicals that they're dealing with in that situation, and help them understand just enough about what they need to know to deal with it. It does allow you to create uniformity of effort. You know, again, when you have thousands of facilities potentially, you don't want thousands of ways of doing something. You want to establish what the best methodology is to deal with that and disseminate it to everybody, so that you assure that it's getting done the best way possible, and also insulates you against any potential injuries or deaths resulting from non-conformity and the resulting lawsuits as well. So those are, I mean, that's a very simplistic job aid. You can break any plan out into a job aid. Certainly, the military does that very well. For anybody who's ever spent any time in the military, any job you had was probably governed by a series of job aids, whether you're tuning a Humvee or fixing an air compressor or cleaning your gun. All of those have job aids associated with it, and you see them a lot throughout emergency management and homeland security. So that's been an evolution in terms of getting these plans out to everybody. It is difficult, so that, you know, those are some of the pros on it. It's difficult to sequence those because, again, they are static, and person A has a job aid in front of it and person B has a job aid in front of them, but the coordination between the two can still be problematic, particularly if person A has to do something and then person B needs to do his or her job next. That's difficult to achieve using the methodology I just described. And then again, this does nothing for your feedback. It does nothing for, unless you say something. I mean, it might say in the job aid, call head office and tell them that you've completed this, or, you know, send them an email or what have you. But that's about the most you're going to get out of this methodology. So it still doesn't solve any of the feedback mechanism, still results in some sluggish response. So that, moving on to really kind of more where the industry is today and where it's going to continue to go. And that is taking those plans that we have, that I've said before were paper bound or Word document or PDF bound, and bring them to life and putting them into systems like some of the ones you see on the screen there. And the great part is these collaboration tools, there are more and more collaboration tools every day. Some of them are your work process tools that you see, like Microsoft Teams or Slack. And they're the kinds of things that you use, we use them in my job to help coordinate efforts on putting together a proposal, for example. So there are lots of those, and they continue to emerge and evolve every day. And some of them, they have the ability to do conferences and video teleconferences and share documents and do assigned tasks and follow up on tasks. Then there are those that are, take those and evolve them just a little bit further into emergency management specific programs. The one on the bottom there is a screenshot from WebEOC. Many of you are familiar with WebEOC. The top one is an Everbridge product that does something similar. But the great things about these are, now in addition to just being a blank template that you can coordinate with folks, these are the type of products that you can take and plug in your plans. And so you can take those expertly written, well thought out, well researched plans that you have and start breaking them down into chunks ahead of time. Put them into the system, and so when you need to, now I'm literally, pulling them off the shelf, and you can't see my air quotes, but now pulling them off the shelf means you activate the digital content of this and push it out to all of your users. And so everybody gets the part of it that's specific to their role in this effort. And so the commander, the on-scene commander, is different than the first responder at the scene, is different than the person at the OC, is different from the media person, it's different from the elected official. All of them, though, have the ability to get the part of the plan that's pertinent to them. They are able to see updates in real time, because as people get assignments and complete assignments, that feeds back into them. They can see graphical information, as you see there on the top of the screen from the earthquake. It has gone from easily accessible to everybody can access it now. No longer are you tied to the desktop computer. You're not tied to a laptop computer. You're not tied to a tablet, to a phone, to a digital watch. Virtually any electronic device these days can tie into these kinds of systems. So everybody involved in this can gain access to it with the information that they likely have on their person right now. Nobody has to run back to an office and get equipment. Nobody has to get to an EOC. Almost everybody is available virtually all of the time. And so that's a fantastic, you go from 0% capability in a situation to nearly 100% capable almost immediately, which is fantastic. I've said already, it's customizable. It really, you can take these kinds of systems and get it down to exactly what that person needs to know, and allow them, again, get them to focus really on what it is they need to do their job. It's real time. These things, as changes occur, as situations occur, as forecasts change, as the feedback changes, that real time will update. You can do just-in-time pushing of tasks. No longer do you need to say, go out and do these 50 things. You can say, go do this thing. All right, now go do this thing. Now go do this thing. And it's because, previously, if you gave them 50 things, by the time they get to step 4, that may be moot at that point. Now you're getting them that task you need them to accomplish right then at that point, so that they can do that. And again, you can link them to additional information as necessary. All the references that you ever dreamed of, you can have at your fingertips, so people can learn more or get more information about whatever it is they're working on as you do it. It's getting easier and easier and easier to do these days. The other parts of these things, I'm skipping to the third bullet here, and if hopefully you can see it, upper right hand corner there, that's looking at the forecast track for Dorian. Actually, it's not the forecast track, that's the actual track that Dorian has taken thus far. These systems are dynamic. I will assure you that what we thought Dorian was going to do a week and a half ago bore little resemblance to what it actually has ended up doing. And that's fairly typical in hurricanes and other natural disasters. Is the closer you get to the actual impact, the more precision you have in that forecast. But when you start off, who knows what that system is going to do? It could fizzle out, it could go the different direction, go somewhere, not impact you at all. And so your systems need to be dynamic to take in those new pieces of content and change your strategies, change your plan, shift your resources, shift your personnel. And in our business, that's more important than almost anything else. You know, the tools like I talked about before, the Microsoft Teams and the Slack and others, those are great if you're doing something at which the end goal doesn't change throughout the process. But in our business, sometimes the end goal at the end of the day is completely different than what you thought it was going to be when you started it. Now I'm starting a video at the bottom, and if you can't see it, it's a train track, and you're starting to see some rainfall there at the beginning of it, fully functioning dry train track. By the end of this video, you won't see anything of it. So your resources will have changed. Your tactics will have changed. Your strategy is going to change. How you need to recover is going to change. So my point is, again, you need a system that's dynamic to allow you to accommodate those kinds of changes. Again, I'm working up. So easily translates into reports. That's another great function here is the easier you can translate the data that you have into situation reports, the less you have to dedicate resources to just focusing on that. You know, we've all had system, been in this business where you had to have somebody whose basic full-time job was to write the situation report. And frankly, by the time they finished it, some of that information in there was too old to be useful, and then they had to start over. When you have systems that can capture data in real time and put it out in front of everybody, those are so much better. And frankly, to the point now where a static situation report is almost unnecessary, because you can have real-time information at any time. A situation report would be a snapshot of it, but you no longer need to deal with snapshots. You can deal with real-time information. And then finally, we'll dive into this more in our next webinar. But when you can go back and relive an incident, and you can do it in sequential order, you can see who did what and when, that really pays off on the backside as you do that after action report. And you can figure out when things went well and when things went wrong, and you can pinpoint who was doing what decisions were made, what information did they have when they made that decision. And so the ability to take this kind of system and utilize it for after action, I think, is really going to improve how we can do after action reports in the future, and subsequently improve how we do our business. So very excited about how these kinds of things are used going forward. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to move on to, these are some closer pictures of what I just showed you there. I'm going to talk about some of the messaging associated with all of this. And so this is tangential to, but related to what we've been discussing thus far with the plans. On this piece of it, I'm going to focus on communicating with the stakeholders, both the stakeholders who are doing the work, but even more so with the stakeholders who need to be aware of what you are doing so that they can play their part. I've been on TV probably 8 times over the last few days, a couple times a day, and almost every time, one of the things I've said is, listen, people who are watching the news, do whatever your local officials are telling you to do. You need, if they're telling you to evacuate, evacuate. If they're saying stay off the road, stay off the road, what have you. And so they are, your success or failure can depend upon, in large part, your ability to have them do what they need to do and understand what it is you're trying to tell them. And so the message content is a primary of primary importance here in order for you to get what you need to get done. So it really is important to think about this. It cannot be an afterthought in how you communicate what is going on to the citizens. It has to be thought of in advance. It has to be contemplated throughout the incident, and you need to really think about the words that you're using and the methodology that you're using to disseminate that and get them to think about things. And so, again, I'm just going to highlight a few things here. On the screen there, on the right-hand side, there are a few links to some best practices in how you do this that will go into much more depth than I will cover here today. And there's obviously a lot of folks who spend a lot of time on this and research on this. And again, if you have any responsibility or relationship to this whatsoever, I encourage you to dive into that. The middle is a screenshot from a FEMA publication regarding the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System. That's a rather lengthy document. Most of it is technical, but there are a couple of pages in there that discuss content that are useful. So if you get a chance to pull that out, but I want to highlight some of the things that these articles and others talk about. One is the timeliness of it. One, what is the time frame between when you're telling somebody something and what it is they need to do in that situation. So you need to contemplate that. And there's obviously a vast difference between, hey, here's a tornado warning in your area right now, go to a shelter right now, go to a place of safety right now, versus 24 hours from now, there might be a foot of snow on the ground and you're going to have a hard time getting around. So you need to prepare for that. So the way you deliver that message and the words you use there and what you're trying to convey are different. And so think about that. What is the urgency with which you're communicating? And that can drive some of the words that you use, the tone which you use to get that message across. You want to focus on what is the desired outcome. You've got to have that in mind before you shape this content and push it out there. So what is it that you want people to do? Do you want them to do something like you do in that tornado warning, or do you just want them to know something? Both are necessary, both are useful, and they have different purposes. But again, think about that so that when you're done with this message, that it's very clear to this person who's on the receiving end, now I know more about this topic, or now I need to go do something. Make sure they do that. As you do this, think about, it doesn't have to be explicit, the authority here, but consider your role in this situation and what your authority is here. And then think about it also in context of what other authorities they may be hearing from. And the authorities are going to be different for schools, cities, counties, states, federal government, what have you. Just kind of consider that and how the end user is going to hear that and think about what you're going to say, because they may not have a clear understanding about the roles of the different organizations and the authorities of these different organizations that you do as a subject matter expert in this area. Think about the frequency. I did a interview on MSNBC this morning, and one of the questions was regarding hurricane fatigue, both from this storm, which has lasted seemingly forever, as well as in Florida, we've had hurricanes now every year. We've had Hermine, Matthew, Irma, Michael, and now Dorian. And similar to the folks in North Carolina who dealt with Florence, we're getting a little tired of them. So how do you consider that when you're messaging out to people? Frequency can be, you want to be more than once, probably, to give people follow-up information, but you also don't want to bombard them with information to the point where they tune you out. So consider what it is you're trying to get them to do, what is the information you're trying to convey, as you plan for the frequency of the information. And that's one of those things you can plan out ahead of time. How often is it that you're going to tell people this information? And then finally, point them to other places where they can go get more information if they want to. You're likely not going to be able to tell them everything there is about that situation, depending on which mechanism you use. And so plan for ways that those who want to can go get additional information. Continuing on here, think about how your audience is expecting to receive the information. And there is no single answer to that. Some of you who are on university campuses, your audience is expecting to hear something differently than those of you who are doing it for a work audience or an internal group. Demographics are going to change. So consider how your audience expects to receive it. Think about the types of audience you have. Again, some of them are going to be homogenous and one methodology is going to work. Some of you have tremendously diverse audiences, and you need to consider a variety of different ways to get this information out there. I've already kind of covered the criticality of the information, the urgency of the information. I've talked about multiple notifications. And again, I think not necessarily multiple or continuing notifications, but think about, like I say here, you all have been through situations, I think, where you're going to get multiple ways of hearing about the most critical life safety information. So when there's a tornado warning, where the radio might go off, you might get an emergency alert to your phone. You might have gotten the notification system that you signed up for your local government and your TV may be doing something all at the same time. And if it's a tornado warning, that's fine. If, however, it's less important, something about the water system, or I say here the bake sale, you're probably going to be a little irritated if all of those happen at the same time. So think about how that's going to work. And also think about the way that you sequence these. It's like I said before, if all of them happen at the same time, probably not problematic. But if they're too far apart in time, it will introduce doubt as to the effectiveness of your system. If they think, why did it take me 5 or 10 minutes to get it through this system as opposed to that system, they're going to lose confidence in that. So be aware of that. Think about how the information is going through technically, and what experience the end user is having in that situation. Here's just a few different ways, examples here. On the left-hand side are some bad emergency alerts, and I think you're probably familiar with them. The worst, of course, if you just Google emergency alerts and anything that describes negative, bad, problematic, incomplete, whatever, you're going to get the Hawaii one. This middle one there was from Oregon at some point about a year ago. Obviously, that one doesn't say what area, it doesn't say what the civil emergency is. It tells you an unclear call to action, and then it has some signature there that nobody is going to understand. Most Oregonians who got this didn't know what OEM was, and they certainly didn't know what (1), OR meant. And so that's, again, a terrible message to go out there, because you've now introduced, not only are you giving them a clear action to take or giving them a piece of knowledge, you've panicked them and created ambiguity in their action items. And so, that's one that you clearly want to avoid. This one, the bottom one there, is tsunami warning in effect for Portland. That was a false message that went out. There was, in fact, no tsunami warning. It wasn't related to an earthquake or an actual tsunami in any way. That was a computer glitch. And, so those kinds of things where cause people to lose confidence in the systems you have. On the other side of the screen, there are some useful ones. So the top right-hand one started off poorly. Fire evacuation notice. Again, that's ambiguous, doesn't help you with anything. But they followed up very quickly afterwards by telling you where it was. And that's important, to be geographically specific about what it is you're looking for. That middle one, talking about the flash flood warning, avoid flood areas, check local media. That's the follow-on piece of it. And most people know how to check the weather. So you're telling them to go there for more specific things. This bottom one, sweet and simple. In that situation, this was post-Hurricane Michael, people need food and water in this county. Here's where it is, at this middle school, and when it is. Go there to get that. So these are just some examples of good and bad. I know all of you have access to lots more of these, but think about these types of things as you do it. Be geographically specific, be time specific, be clear in your action items, be simple. No need for complicated words, and in fact, oftentimes they take up too much space. So I think I read one of those references I showed you earlier said right at a 6th grade level. That's probably a pretty good aim there for the wording that you want to use. All right, so to wrap up here, and I've talked longer than I anticipated, but I always do. First part of the webinar, we talked about, frankly, we've got a lot more information these days, which helps us do our job a whole lot better, but it's going to make it, we really need to update our systems to be able to manage these processes better and execute the plans that we have. And luckily, the tools that help us do that continue to evolve and get much better. And so that's exciting, but it gives us all a little bit more work to do to be able to do our job better. And the bottom part is, again, we are in an exciting era in terms of being able to tell people that something bad is about to happen. My dad and I were discussing that this weekend. It's 100 years ago, a hurricane approaching during Labor Day would have killed thousands of people because most people would not have known about it until it was too late. Now we know about it a week ahead of time. And so that's terrific, but we got to make sure that the way we tell people about it and the methodologies that we use to disseminate that are used to their best advantage. So this is it. I'm happy to start doing some Q's and A's here now. This is a picture of this morning from the National Hurricane Center as a reminder. It's getting pretty active out there right now in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. We still got almost 3 full months left of hurricane season, and it doesn't appear at this point that it's going to slow down anytime. So I'm afraid that the information that I've provided today will be useful to you sooner, perhaps, rather than later. So with that, Sal, happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Sure, thank you so much. So I'm just gonna, I'll leave this up here for a second while we ask our first question. So the first question that came in is, how can you avoid being redundant with other institutions and organizations as you execute your plan?
Hey, that's great. So thanks for that. So the good news is that lots of information are pushing, lots of organizations pushing out information. The bad news is now you can get flooded with these kinds of things and you get tired of it, and you as an organization lose your ability to be heard because you're saying the same thing as everybody else. So for example, in a hurricane like this one we have right now, people are hearing from their schools, their cable company, their phone company, their city government, their county government, their state government, the federal government, and many of them are saying the same thing. So it's important for you to understand who else your audience is hearing from and what those other groups are saying, so that you can distinguish yourself from them and be complementary to them, but reduce the redundancy and overlap there. And so either subscribe to their feeds or use some of the network effect services provided by Everbridge and others, so that you can see all the messages that those folks are sending out. And again, the goal is to be complementary, not as redundant, not as overlapping. Make sure that the message you're saying resonates and isn't just repeating the same thing that everybody else is saying.
Perfect, thank you. So I just flashed back up on the screen how to ask questions. So please do take advantage of the GoToWebinar Q&A functionality to ask your questions. So we do have another one here. How does this tie into the ICS? So I would imagine it's this being the emergency response plan execution strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect complement to the incident command system, in that this is a tool that that the digital systems that I was showing you earlier are a way to more effectively operate within the incident command system. It allows you to disseminate the task, to push the tasks out to those folks who need to do it, for them to report back to you, for them to have all of the information they need to have from their counterparts, their stakeholders, to do this. So I think it's a tool to more effectively utilize the incident command system. The incident command system, as it's, the way that you structure the organization responsible for the incident, that contracts and expands as the incident does. This is a tool to help you do that even better. So I think they're perfectly complementary and hand in glove is the way I envision it.
So another question here, and it's the last one unless we have some more that have come in. So please do submit your questions. If not, we'll end on this one. Brian, could you give an example of having to change a plan mid-execution? So I know, I know you showed the idea of hurricane changing path is like a big plan change. Do you have any other examples of something that's like, as you mentioned, when a hurricane's coming and you do have some buildup, the path change does allow you for some some leeway. But do you have any other examples of just like a plan changing on the minute where you needed to get information out into the field quickly about something they should be doing differently?
Yeah, I think I think one of the things, I'll use Hurricane Irma from a couple of years ago. Up to a certain point in that, we were planning on really kind of the south side of Lake Okeechobee for everybody there to basically remain in place. We got to a point in the storm, in the forecast, with the level of Lake Okeechobee and the water level in Lake Okeechobee and the condition of the dike there, that we lost confidence in that dike to stay in place during the storm, and the potential for a breach and overtopping had increased. So we went from planning on sheltering in place and putting resources to support people where they were, to all up to evacuating and needing to get those people to a place of safety. And so that was a 180-degree shift that needed to be executed immediately, communicated to stakeholders, and action items put in place so that people who were currently focused on one thing, say for example, opening a sheltering location and staffing it and setting it up, now all of a sudden picking up and moving and doing something completely different to get those folks to a different area. So that's just one example. I think many of you all could probably come up similar as the situation changed or evolved, and you just now had to turn on a dime and go a different direction based on the situation as it presented itself.
Interesting. So, and how did you handle that in terms of, I mean, it's easy to just say, hey, plans change, do this instead of that, everybody figure it out, bye. How did you actually, um, how did you give people the information they needed, or, let people know what they needed to think about in terms of their next action items?
Yeah, so some of it was the basic brute force mechanism of conference calls and emails and texts, and some of it was via the digital systems that you saw there, and some of it was both. One of the things that at the state level we didn't necessarily have was a digital system that everybody utilized, and so you kind of start off with the mechanism to get it to all the top level organizations. And then within that top level organization, they would use their own methodology. So some of them had those digital systems in place. Some of them were more of a manual phone tree, other or brute force methods of communication. And so it was a kind of a bit of a hybrid. It's evolving more towards an all-inclusive system that would allow you to do that much more quickly. I think in a lot of places, though, it's still evolving towards that. So you get some best practices and you get some old-fashioned.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to just close it off in another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, no more questions. Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. Brian, thank you for presenting on today's webinar. Thought it was very interesting and useful and timely, and I do agree that some of us are blessed in living in an area that isn't really going to be affected by these hurricanes. Many of us are not, and even if we're not, we're going to be affected by something else. So I think these lessons are universal, and the hurricanes are just prominent in the news example. So thank you again for presenting, and thank you to our audience for sticking around. Again, a reminder to everybody, we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar. It'll give us a day or two to process that recording, and you can use it to review or share with colleagues. And then, also, as Brian mentioned, look for more content from us. One of those pieces of content will be a November webinar, the final in our critical event management series, that is going to focus on the analysis step of critical event management, specifically after action reporting and continuous improvement. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Please stay safe for those of you who are being affected by the storms.